Your marriage was always a joke, Clarissa. My sister Beatrice sneered as she raised her champagne glass at the Riverside Country Club, her voice cutting through the elegant dinner party like a blade. At least now everyone can stop pretending it was going to work out. The entire table of relatives and family friends erupted in cruel laughter, their eyes fixed on me like I was some tragic entertainment for the evening. But when my ex-husband's lawyer called me 3 hours later and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Hartwell, you've just become the primary beneficiary of the Ashford Industries settlement. You're officially the winner in this divorce," I smiled and realized my sister had no idea what was coming. That night, everything changed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me paint you the full picture of that evening, because what happened at the Grandview Manor wasn't just another family gathering, it was the night my entire world flipped upside down in the most unexpected way possible. Picture this. Thornfield's most exclusive venue, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, where the wealthy elite of our small Connecticut town gathered for their monthly social ritual. This wasn't just any dinner party. This was my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration, and my sister Beatrice had insisted on hosting it at the most prestigious location she could find. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked through those heavy oak doors. The hostess, a refined woman with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain before checking her guest list twice. "Clarissa Hartwell?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was surprised someone like me would be attending such an exclusive event. I nodded, smoothing down my simple navy dress, the nicest thing I owned, purchased from a discount store in downtown Maybrook during their end-of-season sale. Compared to the designer gowns and tailored suits around me, I might as well have been wearing a burlap sack. The dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Long mahogany tables draped in cream linen, each place setting featuring bone china that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Fresh white orchids served as centerpieces, their petals so perfect they looked almost artificial in the soft candlelight. The guest list read like a who's who of Thornfield society: the Pemberton family who owned half the real estate in town, Judge Whitmore and his wife, the Cavendish clan who'd made their fortune in shipping, and of course, the crown jewel of the evening, my sister Beatrice and her husband Reginald Blackthorne III, heirs to the Blackthorne pharmaceutical empire. Beatrice had always been the golden child, the one who married into money and status while I had foolishly chosen love over logic. At 32, she was everything our parents had dreamed of in a daughter: poised, connected, wealthy, and ruthlessly ambitious. Her auburn hair was styled in an elaborate updo that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and her emerald silk gown hugged her figure in a way that screamed custom designer. The diamond necklace around her throat caught the light with every gesture, a wedding gift from Reginald that was allegedly worth more than most people's houses. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment. At 29, I was recently separated from my husband of 3 years, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above Murphy's Bakery on Elm Street, and working as a freelance graphic designer, barely making enough to cover my expenses. My marriage to David Ashford had been the subject of family whispers for months. "He's too good for her. She'll never fit into his world." And when the separation became official 6 months ago, those whispers turned into knowing nods and satisfied smirks. But here's what nobody knew, what I hadn't told a single soul because the legal proceedings were still ongoing. My failed marriage was about to become the most successful thing that had ever happened to me. The divorce settlement that everyone assumed would leave me with nothing was actually about to make me incredibly wealthy, thanks to a prenuptial agreement that David's lawyers had written in my favor without his family's knowledge, a clause buried deep in legal jargon that would transfer a significant portion of his family's business holdings to me if the marriage ended due to his infidelity, which, as it turned out, it had. As I stood in that opulent dining room, surrounded by people who had spent years looking down on me, I had no idea that my phone was about to ring with news that would change everything. I had no idea that my sister's cruel words were about to become the most ironic statement she'd ever made. I had no idea that in less than 4 hours, I would go from being the family failure to being wealthier than everyone in that room combined. The evening was about to unfold in ways that would shock them all, starting with my sister's public humiliation of me and ending with the most satisfying phone call of my entire life. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Let me take you back to how this all began, because understanding my relationship with Beatrice is crucial to appreciating how just sweet this revenge would become. We grew up in Thornfield, a picturesque New England town where old money whispers and new money shouts. And my sister had always been the one destined for greatness, while I was expected to fade quietly into the background. Beatrice was born with what our mother called the gift, an uncanny ability to charm her way into any social circle, any opportunity, any heart she set her sights on. Even as children, she possessed this magnetic quality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was homecoming queen, valedictorian, and president of every club that mattered at Thornfield Academy, the private school where all the right families sent their children. I, meanwhile, was the quiet younger sister who preferred sketching in notebooks to schmoozing at society events. Our parents, Harold and Penelope Hartwell, owned a modest but respectable accounting firm that served many of Thornfield's elite families. We were comfortable, but we weren't wealthy, a distinction that mattered tremendously in a town where your zip code determined your social worth. While we lived in a charming colonial on Maple Avenue, we weren't mansion on the hill material, and that difference shaped everything about how we were raised. Beatrice understood early on that marrying well was her ticket to the life she craved. She studied the social dynamics of Thornfield like a chess master, carefully cultivating relationships with the daughters of prominent families, volunteering for the right charities, attending the right functions. By the time she was 25, she had successfully snared Reginald Blackthorne III, heir to Blackthorne Pharmaceuticals, a company that had been manufacturing prescription medications since the 1940s and was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their wedding was the social event of the decade in Thornfield. The ceremony took place at St. Augustine's Cathedral, followed by a reception at the historic Willowbrook estate that was featured in Connecticut Lifestyle magazine. Beatrice wore a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people's cars, and the guest list included senators, business moguls, and even a minor European royal who happened to be Reginald's distant cousin. I, on the other hand, had always been more interested in authenticity than status. While Beatrice was networking at charity galas, I was building my freelance graphic design business from our parents' basement, working with small local companies and startups who appreciated creativity over connections. I met David Ashford not at some exclusive social event, but at a coffee shop in downtown Millbrook, where I was working on a logo design for a local bookstore, and he was reading legal briefs for his environmental law practice. David was different from the men in Beatrice's circle. He came from wealth. His family owned Ashford Industries, a successful construction and development company, but he had chosen to pursue environmental law instead of joining the family business. He drove a hybrid car, donated to wildlife conservation charities, and genuinely seemed more interested in making a difference than making money. When we started dating, I thought I had found someone who valued the same things I did: substance over surface, meaning over materialism. Our wedding was simple but beautiful, held in the garden behind the Thornfield Inn with just 50 guests, mostly close friends and family. Beatrice made sure everyone knew she thought it was quaint and so very Clarissa to choose such a modest venue. She couldn't understand why I hadn't pushed for something grander, especially given David's family wealth. But that was exactly the point. I wanted our marriage to be about us, not about impressing other people. What I didn't realize at the time was that David's family had their own opinions about appropriate matches for their heir. To them, I was exactly what Beatrice accused me of being. Not quite good enough, not quite wealthy enough, not quite connected enough. They tolerated me because David insisted, but I was never truly welcomed into their world of country clubs and corporate boards. For 3 years, I tried to make it work, believing that love would be enough to bridge the gap between our different backgrounds and expectations. I had no idea that David was struggling with his own demons, or that his family's pressure to marry appropriately would eventually lead him to make choices that would destroy our marriage, but ironically, secure my financial future in ways I never could have imagined. The pattern of how differently Beatrice and I were treated became crystal clear once she married into the Blackthorn family. Suddenly, every family gathering became a showcase of her elevated status, while I was systematically relegated to the role of the disappointing younger sister who had made poor life choices. Take Christmas dinner at our parents' house, for example. Before Beatrice's marriage, we used to have cozy, intimate celebrations with homemade decorations and Mom's famous honey-glazed ham. But after she became Mrs. Reginald Blackthorn III, Christmas transformed into something resembling a magazine photo shoot. Beatrice would arrive fashionably late in her black Mercedes, wearing designer winter coats that cost more than my quarterly income, carrying professionally wrapped gifts from Tiffany and Cartier. The gifts themselves told the story. Beatrice would present our parents with elaborate presents, a weekend getaway to Martha's Vineyard for their anniversary, a complete kitchen renovation because you deserve the best, or jewelry from exclusive boutiques in Manhattan. I, meanwhile, would offer handmade photo albums, carefully curated gift baskets from local artisans, or commissioned artwork from up-and-coming artists I'd discovered through my design work. While my gifts were thoughtful and personal, they were always overshadowed by Beatrice's extravagant displays of wealth. The most devastating example happened during Mother's Day 2 years ago. I had spent weeks creating a custom photo book chronicling our family's history, complete with restored vintage photographs, handwritten family recipes, and personal notes from relatives. It was a labor of love that represented hours of research, design work, and genuine sentiment. Beatrice showed up with a diamond tennis bracelet from Tiffany that probably cost $15,000. Mom barely glanced through my photo book before setting it aside, but she spent 20 minutes admiring the bracelet, immediately putting it on and calling 3 different friends to tell them about Beatrice's incredible generosity. That afternoon, I found my photo book sitting on a side table in the den, forgotten and unmentioned, while Mom wore her new bracelet to the country club that very evening. The differential treatment extended beyond material gifts to every aspect of our family interactions. When Beatrice spoke, everyone listened with rapt attention, hanging on her every word about charity board meetings, exclusive social events, or her latest interior design projects for their sprawling estate. She could captivate the entire dinner table with stories about rubbing shoulders with Connecticut's political elite or attending gallery openings in Manhattan where she'd met minor celebrities. When I tried to share updates about my graphic design work, landing a new client, creating a particularly challenging logo, or helping a small business rebrand, the conversation would quickly shift to something else. My parents would nod politely and make appropriate sounds, but their eyes would glaze over. There was no excitement, no follow-up questions, no genuine interest in my professional accomplishments. It was as if my career was a cute hobby rather than a legitimate business venture. The social aspect was perhaps the most painful. Beatrice's circle included the wives of prominent businessmen, daughters of established families, and women who wielded significant influence in Thornfield's social hierarchy. They organized elaborate dinner parties, charity fundraisers, and exclusive book clubs where membership was by invitation only. I was never invited to these gatherings, despite being family.
When I mentioned feeling left out, Beatrice would laugh and say, "Oh, Clarissa, you wouldn't enjoy it anyway. These events are so formal and stuffy, totally not your style." But then I'd see photos on social media of these supposedly stuffy events, and they looked amazing. Beautiful venues, incredible food, interesting speakers, and lively conversations. Beatrice was systematically excluding me from an entire social world while pretending it was for my own benefit. The pattern extended to family celebrations as well. When planning our parents' anniversary party, Beatrice took complete control, selecting the venue, the menu, the guest list, and even the color scheme without consulting me. When I offered to help with the planning or contribute financially, she'd wave me off with condescending comments like, "Don't worry about it, sweetie. I've got this handled. You just focus on whatever it is you're working on." She'd make decisions about family events as if I didn't exist, then present them as fait accompli. "We're having the party at the country club," she'd announce, never mentioning that the venue would cost thousands of dollars or that I hadn't been consulted about the budget. When I couldn't afford to contribute equally to her elaborate plans, she'd make passive-aggressive comments about everyone contributing what they can, while making it clear that my financial limitations were both noted and pitied. The most telling pattern was how our respective relationships were discussed within the family. Beatrice's marriage to Reginald was constantly celebrated as a fairy tale romance, despite the fact that their relationship seemed more like a business merger than a love story. They attended obligatory social functions together, maintained separate interests and friend groups, and I rarely saw them display genuine affection toward each other. My marriage to David, on the other hand, was treated as an ongoing concern that required constant monitoring and commentary. Family members would ask probing questions about our finances, our living situation, our future plans, always with an undertone suggesting that I was somehow failing to meet expectations. When David and I chose to live modestly, prioritizing experiences over material possessions, family members would exchange worried glances as if our choices were symptoms of some deeper problem. Looking back now, I can see how the systematic devaluation prepared the ground for what would happen at that anniversary dinner. The pattern of dismissing my worth, minimizing my contributions, and treating me as less deserving had been established over years of subtle and not-so-subtle comparisons. Beatrice had successfully positioned herself as the family success story while casting me as the cautionary tale. And everyone had accepted this narrative without question. Beatrice's cruelty wasn't accidental or impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. She had perfected the art of cutting me down in ways that appeared almost caring to outsiders, masking her venom behind a veneer of sisterly concern that made her attacks even more painful because I couldn't defend myself without appearing ungrateful or overly sensitive. Her favorite weapon was the backhanded compliment, delivered with a sweet smile and just enough witnesses to ensure maximum humiliation. At family barbecues, she'd examine my outfit with theatrical concern and announce, "Oh, Clarissa, you look so comfortable. I just love how you're not afraid to wear the same dress to multiple events. It's so practical." The emphasis on practical always came with a little laugh, as if my inability to afford a new outfit for every occasion was endearingly quaint rather than financially necessary. During my separation from David, her commentary became particularly vicious. She'd corner me at family gatherings with her signature concerned expression, tilting her head slightly to the side like a therapist preparing to deliver difficult news. "You know, sweetie, I've been thinking about your situation, and I wonder if perhaps you weren't quite prepared for marriage to someone from David's background. These things require a certain level of social sophistication that not everyone naturally possesses."
The word sophistication became her favorite cudgel. According to Beatrice, I lacked the sophistication to navigate David's family's expectations, the sophistication to maintain a marriage within elite social circles, and the sophistication to understand why certain relationships were destined to fail. She'd deliver these assessments with the authority of someone who had successfully married into wealth, as if her strategic courtship of Reginald somehow qualified her as an expert on authentic relationships. Her public humiliations were masterfully orchestrated performances. At our cousin Rebecca's wedding reception, Beatrice stood up during the family toast portion and spoke beautifully about the importance of marriage, family support, and finding the right partner. Then, as she raised her champagne glass, she added with a pointed look in my direction, "And for those of us who might not have been so fortunate in our first attempts at love, remember that there's always hope for better choices in the future." The entire reception fell silent for a moment before nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. She had an uncanny ability to weaponize family loyalty against me. Whenever I tried to address her behavior privately, she'd act shocked and wounded, turning the conversation into an attack on my character. "I can't believe you'd think such terrible things about me," she'd say, tears welling in her perfectly lined eyes. "I'm only trying to help you see reality, Clarissa. Someone has to care enough about you to tell you the truth, and apparently that someone has to be me." This manipulation extended to our parents, who had become completely enchanted by Beatrice's success and corresponding generosity toward them. She'd upgraded their car, paid for home renovations, and funded their dream vacation to Europe, all while making subtle comments about how she wished I could contribute more to the family, but understood that not everyone is in a position to help. These statements always came with a resigned sigh, as if my financial limitations were a personal failing rather than a natural consequence of choosing a modest lifestyle. The most insidious aspect of her behavior was how she'd position herself as my protector while simultaneously destroying my reputation. At dinner parties, she'd intercept conversations about my work with statements like, "Oh, Clarissa is so creative. She's always been the artistic one in the family. Of course, it's a challenging field financially, but she's so passionate about her little design projects." The diminutive language, little projects, artistic phase, creative endeavors, made my legitimate business sound like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. She'd also rewrite history to suit her narrative. According to Beatrice's version of events, my marriage to David had always been doomed because I'd never understood how to be a proper wife to someone of his caliber. She'd tell anyone who'd listen about how she'd tried to mentor me, offering advice about appropriate social behavior, wardrobe choices, and conversation topics, but I'd been too stubborn or naive to accept her guidance. I tried to help her understand what David's family expected. She'd confide to other family members during my separation, her voice heavy with disappointment. I offered to take her shopping for more appropriate clothes, to introduce her to the right social circles, even to teach her about wine and proper dinner etiquette. But Clarissa always thought she knew better. She wanted to do everything her own way, and look how that turned out. These conversations would inevitably make their way back to me through well-meaning relatives who thought I should know what Beatrice was saying out of concern. Each retelling felt like another small death, another piece of evidence that my family had accepted Beatrice's assessment of my failures as objective truth. Her cruelest innovation was the art of public concern. She'd approach me at family events with elaborate displays of worry, speaking loudly enough for others to overhear while pretending to be discreet. "Clarissa, honey, are you eating enough? You look so thin lately. I know this divorce situation must be incredibly stressful. Have you considered seeing someone professional to help you work through these issues?" The implication was always that I was falling apart, unable to cope with the dissolution of my marriage, while she remained the stable, successful sister who had everything figured out.
When I tried to defend myself or correct her mischaracterizations, she'd respond with hurt confusion, as if my pushback was evidence of my instability rather than a natural response to her attacks. "I don't understand why you're being so defensive," she'd say, looking around at other family members for support. "I'm only trying to be supportive during this difficult time. Maybe you're more upset about the divorce than you're willing to admit." The genius of her approach was how it made me complicit in my own humiliation. Any attempt to call out her behavior would be reframed as evidence of my emotional fragility, while her attacks would be repositioned as loving concern from a devoted sister. She'd created a perfect trap where defending myself only confirmed her narrative about my inability to handle criticism or accept reality. By the time we reached that anniversary dinner at Grandview Manor, Beatrice had spent years establishing herself as the authority on my failures and limitations. She'd positioned herself as the family expert on appropriate behavior, successful relationships, and social expectations, while casting me as the perpetually struggling younger sister who needed constant guidance and correction. This foundation of established superiority would make her public humiliation of me that night seem not cruel, but almost inevitable. Just another example of Beatrice telling uncomfortable truths that everyone else was too polite to voice.
Despite years of Beatrice's calculated cruelty, I remained trapped in the delusion that somehow, someday, I could earn her respect and genuine affection. Like someone caught in an emotional gambling addiction, I kept investing more effort, more vulnerability, more hope into a relationship that was systematically designed to disappoint me. Each small gesture of apparent kindness from her felt like validation that maybe, just maybe, I was finally breaking through her cold exterior. I convinced myself that our relationship could be repaired if I just tried harder to meet her standards. When she criticized my wardrobe choices, I started saving every spare dollar to buy nicer clothes, thinking that if I looked more like her vision of success, she'd finally see me as an equal. I'd spend hours researching fashion trends, studying what the wives in her social circle wore to various events, trying to decode the mysterious language of appropriate attire that seemed to come so naturally to her. The pathetic irony was that even when I managed to afford a designer dress or splurged on professional hairstyling for family events, Beatrice would find new ways to diminish my efforts. "Oh, you look lovely," she'd say with surprise that felt more insulting than a direct criticism. "I hardly recognized you. It's amazing what the right styling can do." The implication was always that my improved appearance was an aberration, a temporary departure from my naturally inferior state, rather than evidence that I could, in fact, present myself appropriately. I threw myself into learning about wine, art, literature, and current events, subjects that dominated conversations in her social circle. I'd spend my evenings reading the Wall Street Journal, Wine Spectator, and art criticism magazines, desperately trying to build the cultural literacy that Beatrice claimed I lacked. When opportunities arose to contribute to dinner conversations about market trends or emerging artists, I'd carefully insert my newly acquired knowledge, hoping to demonstrate that I wasn't the unsophisticated simpleton she portrayed me as. But these attempts at intellectual participation were met with subtle dismissal. Beatrice would listen to my comments with a patient smile, then redirect the conversation to someone else, or worse, repeat my observation in slightly different words, as if she was translating my thoughts into a more palatable form for the other guests. "What Clarissa is trying to say," she'd begin, before essentially restating my point, but with more authority and confidence, claiming credit for the insight while making me feel like I'd failed to express myself adequately. The most heartbreaking aspect of my continued efforts was how I kept believing that family events would be different. Each invitation to a birthday celebration, holiday gathering, or special occasion filled me with renewed optimism. This time,
I told myself would be the time when Beatrice would finally acknowledge my worth. This time she'd see past whatever prejudices or resentments had shaped her treatment of me and recognize that I deserved respect and inclusion. I'd prepare for these events like a diplomat preparing for crucial negotiations. I'd plan my outfits carefully, research topics of conversation, and even rehearse responses to potential criticisms. I'd arrive early to help with setup, bringing thoughtful hostess gifts and offering to assist with whatever tasks needed attention. I genuinely believed that consistent demonstration of my good intentions and capabilities would eventually wear down her resistance. When David and I were still married, I harbored the particularly naive hope that my connection to his family's wealth and status would finally earn Beatrice's approval. I thought that being married to someone from an established, affluent family proved that I wasn't the social liability she had always portrayed me as. For a brief period, when the Ashford name still carried weight in our interactions, I felt like I was finally competing on level ground. I'd drop casual references to David's environmental law cases, his family's business holdings, or social events we'd attended together, hoping these connections would demonstrate my legitimate place in Thornfield's social hierarchy. When we received invitations to country club events or charity fundraisers, I'd make sure Beatrice knew about them, pathetically seeking her validation that I was finally moving in appropriate circles. But even during this period of relative social status, Beatrice found ways to undermine my confidence. She'd make comments about how lucky I was that David's family was so accommodating toward me, or how patient David must be in helping me navigate social situations I wasn't naturally equipped to handle. She'd frame my marriage not as evidence of my worth, but as proof of David's charity in taking on someone so clearly beneath his station. When my marriage began showing signs of strain, my desperation to maintain Beatrice's newfound grudging respect intensified. I started hiding problems, pretending everything was perfect when family members asked about my relationship. I'd craft elaborate stories about romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and future plans with David, terrified that admitting to marital difficulties would give Beatrice ammunition to resume her full-scale assault on my character. The separation announcement was devastating, not just because of the personal failure it represented, but because I knew it would validate every criticism Beatrice had ever made about my unsuitability for marriage within elite social circles. I spent weeks dreading the inevitable family conversation where she'd express her mock sympathy while barely concealing her satisfaction at being proven right about my limitations. Even after the separation became public knowledge, I continued trying to salvage some dignity in Beatrice's eyes. I emphasized David's role in our marital problems, hoping to demonstrate that the failure wasn't entirely my fault. I talked about my growing graphic design business, my increasing independence, and my plans for rebuilding my life as evidence that I wasn't completely destroyed by the divorce.
I'd send her articles about successful women entrepreneurs, hoping to plant seeds that maybe my chosen career path had value and potential. When I landed particularly prestigious clients or received positive feedback on my work, I'd find ways to mention these achievements during family conversations, still seeking that elusive moment of genuine pride or approval from her. The most pathetic aspect of my continued efforts was how I'd interpret neutral responses as progress. When Beatrice didn't actively criticize something I'd done or said, I'd convince myself that she was warming up to me. When she asked polite questions about my work or living situation, I'd read genuine interest into what were probably just social pleasantries. I was so starved for her approval that I'd mistake the absence of hostility for the presence of affection. Looking back, I can see how this pattern of false hope and renewed effort kept me trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse,
Each time I convinced myself that things were improving, I'd become more vulnerable to the next wave of disappointment. I'd lower my defenses, share more personal information, and invest more emotional energy in the relationship, only to have Beatrice use that vulnerability against me in increasingly sophisticated ways. This cycle of hope and disappointment had trained me to accept crumbs of respect as feast-worthy validation, making me grateful for basic human decency while tolerating behavior that should have been completely unacceptable. By the time we reached that anniversary dinner, I'd been so conditioned to seek Beatrice's approval that I was completely unprepared for the level of public humiliation she was about to unleash. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, the kind of formal stationery that immediately signaled this wouldn't be an ordinary family gathering. Harold and Penelope Hartwell request the pleasure of your company at a celebration of their 35th wedding anniversary, it read, followed by details that made my stomach drop. Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, Grandview Manor, Thornfield. Black tie requested. Beatrice had orchestrated this entire event, of course. When I called my mother to ask about the party planning, she gushed about how thoughtful and generous Beatrice was being, taking care of every detail so our parents could simply enjoy their special night. She's reserved the entire east wing of Grandview Manor, Mom explained breathlessly. Can you imagine? The same room where the Pemberton wedding reception was held last spring. And she's hired that wonderful catering company from Hartford. You know, the one that did the mayor's daughter's engagement party? The pressure to make this evening perfect felt enormous, not just because it was our parents' milestone anniversary, but because I sensed this would be a pivotal moment in our family dynamics. Beatrice had been building towards something for months, dropping hints about how important this celebration would be, how it would bring the whole family together, how it represented everything our parents had worked for their entire lives. I spent weeks preparing for this event with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This felt like my opportunity to finally step up, to prove that I could be an equal participant in our family's important moments, rather than just the struggling younger sister who showed up and hoped for the best. I was determined to contribute meaningfully to our parents' celebration, to demonstrate that my love and respect for them was just as profound as Beatrice's, even if I couldn't express it through expensive gestures. The gift selection process became an agonizing exercise in trying to find something that would resonate emotionally while competing with whatever extravagant surprise Beatrice had planned. I knew I couldn't match her financially, that was impossible, and honestly beside the point. But I could create something personal and meaningful that would remind our parents of the life they'd built together and the family they'd raised. After considerable research and planning, I decided to commission a custom piece of art from Elena Rodriguez, a talented painter I'd worked with on several design projects. She specialized in creating personalized family portraits that incorporated meaningful locations and symbolic elements. I provided her with dozens of family photographs spanning 3 decades, along with detailed descriptions of places that held special significance for my parents. Their first apartment on Birch Street, the garden where Dad proposed to Mom, the front porch of our childhood home where we'd spent countless summer evenings. It was a celebration of their journey together, their values, and their legacy. But the gift was just one aspect of my preparation. I'd also arranged for a surprise video message from Uncle Robert, Dad's brother who lived in California and couldn't attend in person. I'd contacted dozens of their friends, former colleagues, and extended family members, collecting written messages and photographs that I'd compiled into a memory book. Each page told a story about different chapters of their relationship, from their college courtship through their early marriage struggles, career achievements, and the joy of raising their children. The outfit selection process was equally intense. I understood that this event would be photographed extensively, that the images would become part of our family's historical record, and that my appearance would either support or undermine my credibility as a daughter worthy of respect. I'd saved for months to purchase a sophisticated black dress from a boutique in downtown Hartford, something elegant but not flashy, appropriate for a formal anniversary celebration.
I'd also made appointments for professional hair and makeup styling, determined to present myself as someone who belonged at such an upscale venue. This wasn't about vanity or trying to impress anyone. It was about showing respect for the occasion and for my parents, who deserved to have both their daughters look appropriately elegant for their special evening. The week leading up to the anniversary party, I could barely concentrate on my design work. Every conversation with family members was analyzed for clues about what Beatrice might be planning, what the evening's agenda would include, who else would be attending. I practiced potential toasts in my bathroom mirror, rehearsing what I might say if called upon to speak about my parents' marriage and what it had meant to our family. The venue itself added another layer of pressure. Grandview Manor wasn't just any event space. It was Thornfield's most prestigious location for high society celebrations. The building had been a private estate in the early 1900s before being converted into an exclusive event venue that hosted only the most important social functions. Walking through those doors would mean entering a world where every detail mattered, where social missteps were noticed and remembered, where the difference between belonging and merely being tolerated became painfully obvious. I'd driven past Grandview Manor several times in the weeks before the party, trying to familiarize myself with the layout and atmosphere. The building was imposing, 3 stories of Georgian architecture surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens and circular driveways designed to accommodate luxury vehicles. Even from the outside, it radiated the kind of old money elegance that made middle-class visitors feel simultaneously impressed and intimidated. The guest list Beatrice had assembled represented Thornfield's social elite: business leaders, prominent attorneys, successful physicians, and established families whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of local newspapers. These weren't just our parents' friends. They were Beatrice's carefully curated audience for whatever performance she had planned for the evening. As the date approached, I found myself oscillating between excitement and anxiety. Part of me genuinely looked forward to celebrating my parents' milestone anniversary, to seeing them honored and appreciated by their community. But another part of me sensed that Beatrice had orchestrated this event for reasons beyond simple family celebration. There was something calculated about her enthusiasm, something performative about her attention to every detail. The night before the party, I laid out my dress, shoes, and accessories with military precision. I'd written notes about conversation topics that might arise, researched recent news that could provide appropriate small talk material, and even practiced walking in my heels to ensure I wouldn't stumble or appear awkward on the polished marble floors of Grandview Manor. I had no way of knowing that all this preparation, the perfect gift, the appropriate outfit, the careful planning, would become irrelevant in the face of what Beatrice had actually planned for that evening. I'd been preparing for a family celebration, but she'd been orchestrating a public execution disguised as an anniversary party. The evening began with all the elegance I anticipated. Grandview Manor's East Wing had been transformed into a vision of sophisticated celebration, with towering floral arrangements of white roses and baby's breath, soft jazz music flowing from a string quartet positioned near the marble fireplace, and waitstaff in crisp uniforms gliding between guests with crystal champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. I arrived precisely on time, my carefully chosen black dress flowing gracefully as I walked through the ornate entrance hall. The professional styling had been worth every penny, My hair was swept into an elegant updo, my makeup subtle but polished, my overall appearance finely matching the sophisticated atmosphere that Beatrice always seemed to embody effortlessly. For the first hour, everything proceeded beautifully. Our parents looked radiant, Dad distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, and Mom glowing in a silver gown that Beatrice had helped her select from an exclusive boutique in Manhattan. The guest list was impressive. Judge Whitmore and his wife chatting with the Cavendish family near the grand piano, Dr. Pemberton sharing stories with several other prominent physicians, and Reginald working the room with the practiced ease of someone born into high society. I mingled confidently, my weeks of preparation paying off as I engaged in conversations about local politics, recent charity fundraisers, and developments in Thornfield's business community. Several guests complimented my appearance, and Mrs. Cavendish even mentioned that she'd heard wonderful things about my graphic design work from mutual acquaintances. For a brief, shining moment, I felt like I truly belonged in this sophisticated gathering. Beatrice moved through the crowd like a queen holding court, resplendent in navy blue silk gown that probably cost more than my rent for 6 months. She'd positioned herself as the evening's unofficial hostess, accepting compliments on the venue selection, the menu choices, and the overall elegance of the celebration. Every few minutes, someone would approach her to praise her thoughtfulness in organizing such a magnificent tribute to our parents. The shift in atmosphere was so subtle at first that I almost missed it. During the cocktail hour, I noticed Beatrice engaging in hushed conversations with several guests, her expression serious and concerned. She'd lean in close to whisper something. The listener would glance in my direction with what appeared to be sympathy or pity, and then they'd both nod gravely as if discussing some tragic situation that required delicate handling. When dinner was announced and guests began moving toward the elegantly appointed dining room, I assumed I'd be seated at the main family table, with our parents, Beatrice, Reginald, and perhaps a few close family friends. This was standard protocol for anniversary celebrations. Immediate family members positioned prominently to participate in toasts and speeches throughout the evening. But as I approached the head table, Beatrice intercepted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, Clarissa," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to overhear, "I need to talk to you about the seating arrangements. There's been a little situation." The word situation was delivered with the kind of weighted emphasis that immediately suggested something embarrassing or problematic. Several guests paused their conversations, sensing drama about to unfold. I felt my carefully constructed confidence beginning to crack as Beatrice guided me slightly away from the main table, her hand on my elbow in a gesture that appeared supportive but felt controlling. "You see," she continued, her voice taking on that familiar tone of mock concern, "when I was finalizing tonight's arrangements, I realized that having you at the main table might create some awkwardness." She paused dramatically, glancing around to ensure she had an audience for whatever revelation was coming. "Given your recent divorce situation and the circumstances surrounding it, I thought it might be more comfortable for everyone if you sat elsewhere." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face burning with humiliation as I processed what she was suggesting, that my presence at our parents' anniversary celebration would somehow taint the evening, that my failed marriage made me an inappropriate representative of family success and stability. "I don't understand," I managed to whisper, hoping to keep this conversation private despite the growing number of guests who had noticed our exchange. "This is Mom and Dad's anniversary. I'm their daughter." Beatrice's expression shifted to one of patient condescension, as if she was explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. "Of course you are, sweetheart, and we love you very much. But tonight is about celebrating lasting love, commitment, and family success.
She gestured toward the main table where our parents were already seated, beaming at their elegant surroundings. Your marriage was always a joke, Clarissa. At least now everyone can stop pretending it was going to work out. The sentence landed with devastating precision in the sudden silence that had fallen over our immediate vicinity. The string quartet continued playing in the background, but the conversations around us had ceased as guests processed what they just witnessed. I felt dozens of eyes on me, watching my reaction to this public character assassination disguised as family concern. Your presence at the head table would just remind everyone of how these things can go wrong when people make impractical choices. Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her theme. David's family has already been through enough embarrassment without having to explain your situation to their social circle again tonight. She gestured toward a small table positioned near the kitchen entrance, partially hidden behind a decorative screen and clearly intended for overflow seating or staff members who needed to remain available during the event. I've arranged a lovely spot for you over there. You'll still be part of the celebration, just more discreetly positioned. The humiliation was so complete, so unexpected that I couldn't immediately formulate a response. I stood there in my carefully chosen dress, with my professionally styled hair and makeup, feeling like an actress who'd suddenly forgotten all her lines in the middle of a crucial scene. The weeks of preparation, the thoughtful gifts, the genuine excitement about honoring our parents, all of it crumbled in the face of Beatrice's calculated cruelty. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat uncomfortably and turned away, suddenly finding his champagne glass fascinating. Mrs. Cavendish, who had complimented my work just an hour earlier, now looked at me with undisguised pity. Dr. Pemberton shook his head slightly as if witnessing something regrettably predictable. Beatrice, I started, my voice barely audible, this is our parents' anniversary. They want both their daughters. Our parents want their anniversary to be perfect. And perfect means not having to worry about family drama or uncomfortable explanations. She lowered her voice to a stage whisper that somehow carried farther than her normal speaking tone. Everyone here knows about your divorce, Clarissa. They know about David's indiscretions. They know about the settlement negotiations. Having you prominently displayed at the family table would just make everyone uncomfortable. The reference to David's infidelity, something I'd confided to Beatrice during a moment of weakness and vulnerability, felt like the final twist of the knife. She'd taken my private pain and weaponized it for public consumption, using my deepest humiliation as justification for excluding me from my own family celebration. As I stood there, surrounded by Thornfield's social elite, I realized that this entire evening had been orchestrated not to honor our parents, but to provide Beatrice with the perfect stage for my complete and utter humiliation. Every detail, from the prestigious venue to the carefully curated guest list, had been designed to maximize the impact of this moment when she would publicly declare me unworthy of a place at my own family's table. The walk to that isolated table felt like a death march through a gauntlet of silent judgment. Every step across the polished marble floor echoed in my ears, amplified by the sudden quiet that had descended over the dining room as word of my banishment spread through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. The elegant black dress that had made me feel confident and appropriate just moments earlier now felt like a costume I had no right to wear, a pathetic attempt to disguise the fundamental inadequacy that Beatrice had just exposed for everyone to see. The table she'd assigned me was positioned in what could charitably be called the social equivalent of Siberia. Tucked behind a decorative folding screen painted with delicate cherry blossoms, it sat in the shadow of the main dining area where all the important conversations and celebrations would take place. The tablecloth was the same crisp white linen as the others, the china equally elegant, but the location sent an unmistakable message about my status in this family hierarchy. As I approached my designated exile, I discovered I wouldn't be completely alone.
Already seated were Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who cleaned our parents' house twice a week, Timothy, the teenage son of the catering manager who was helping serve tonight, and Margaret Sullivan, a distant cousin from our father's side who had battled alcoholism for years and was generally considered the family embarrassment at social gatherings. This was my assigned peer group, the hired help, the children, and the relatives too problematic to sit with respectable company. Mrs. Henderson looked at me with genuine confusion as I pulled out my chair. "Clarissa, dear, shouldn't you be sitting with your family?" she asked in her gentle Irish accent. The kindness in her voice made my situation even more humiliating because it highlighted how obviously wrong this arrangement was to anyone with basic human decency. "There was a seating issue," I managed to reply, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason for my banishment, couldn't repeat Beatrice's devastating assessment of my worthiness to represent our family at their own anniversary celebration. Timothy, bless his teenage heart, tried to make conversation. "My mom says you do graphic design stuff. That's pretty cool. Like making logos and websites and things?" His enthusiasm was genuine, but it only emphasized how young and naive you had to be to think my career was impressive, rather than merely adequate. From my position behind the screen, I had a partial view of the main dining area where the real celebration was taking place. I could see our parents at the head table, radiant with joy as they received congratulations and toasts from Thornfield's most prominent citizens. Dad looked distinguished and proud, raising his champagne glass in response to well wishes from Judge Whitmore. Mom glowed with happiness, her silver gown catching the crystal chandelier light as she laughed at something Reginald had whispered in her ear. Beatrice commanded the table like the accomplished hostess she'd become, gracefully directing conversations, ensuring everyone's champagne flutes remained full, and accepting compliments on the evening's elegant arrangements. She looked absolutely perfect in her navy silk gown, every gesture calculated to reinforce her image as the successful daughter who had elevated the entire family's social standing through her advantageous marriage. The first course arrived, delicate butternut squash soup garnished with truffle oil and toasted pumpkin seeds. At the main tables, guests were engaged in animated discussions about local politics, recent charity fundraisers, and upcoming social events. The conversation was sophisticated, engaging, exactly the kind of intellectual discourse I'd spent weeks preparing to participate in. Instead, I found myself making polite small talk with Mrs. Henderson about her arthritis medication and listening to Timothy explain his high school chemistry projects. When the waitstaff began serving the main course, herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted root vegetables, I watched through the decorative screen as my carefully commissioned family portrait was presented to our parents. From my exile, I could see Mom's face light up with genuine delight as she examined the artwork, pointing out details to Dad and other guests who gathered around to admire the piece. It was everything I'd hoped for when I'd commissioned it, a meaningful, personal tribute that captured decades of love and family memories. But instead of being present to explain the symbolism Elena had woven into the painting, to share the stories behind each carefully chosen detail, I was relegated to watching from behind a screen like some uninvited observer at my own family celebration. Beatrice stepped forward to field questions about the artwork, positioning herself as the daughter who understood the significance of such thoughtful gestures, while I remained invisible in my designated corner. The memory book I'd spent weeks compiling was presented during the second course, and again I watched from a distance as our parents flipped through photographs and written messages from friends and family members spanning 3 decades. Dad actually teared up reading Uncle Robert's contribution, and Mom showed several pages to nearby guests who nodded appreciatively at the obvious care and effort that had gone into creating such a comprehensive tribute. Yet,
Even these deeply personal gifts, products of my genuine love and respect for our parents, couldn't earn me a place at the table where they were being celebrated. Beatrice had successfully separated me from my own contributions, allowing me to provide the emotional labor while denying me any credit or inclusion in the recognition that followed. The most devastating moment came during the toast portion of the evening. Our father stood, champagne glass in hand, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room as he thanked everyone for joining their celebration. He spoke about the importance of family, the joy of seeing his daughters grown and settled, the pride he felt in the life he and Mom had built together in Thornfield. He said, "We're especially grateful to Beatrice for organizing this beautiful evening and bringing together so many dear friends to share in our happiness. Her thoughtfulness and generosity have made this anniversary truly unforgettable." The applause was enthusiastic and sustained. Beatrice stood graciously, accepting congratulations from the other guests, while our parents beamed with obvious pride. No mention was made of the artwork, the memory book, or any of the contributions I'd made to the evening's success. From my position behind the screen, I might as well have been completely absent from the celebration.
Margaret Sullivan, who had been quietly nursing her single glass of wine throughout the meal, leaned over and whispered, "This is bullshit, Clarissa. You don't deserve this treatment." Her words, slurred slightly but sincere, carried more kindness than I'd received from any other family member all evening. As the evening progressed and the conversations at the main tables grew more animated with the influence of excellent wine and expensive champagne, I found myself shrinking further into my chair, my carefully applied makeup feeling heavy and artificial, my professional styling now seeming like an elaborate disguise that had fooled no one. The weeks of preparation, the months of saving money for the perfect outfit, the genuine excitement about honoring our parents, all of it had been rendered meaningless by Beatrice's calculated cruelty. I sat there in my exile, picking at expertly prepared food that tasted like ash, listening to the sounds of genuine celebration happening just yards away, but feeling more isolated than if I'd been completely alone in my apartment. This wasn't just exclusion, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as family concern, a public execution of my dignity carried out in the most elegant possible setting. I was mechanically cutting through a piece of chocolate torte that I had no appetite for when my phone vibrated in my small evening clutch. The sound seemed impossibly loud in my corner of exile, and I quickly fumbled to silence it, not wanting to draw any additional negative attention to myself. The last thing I needed was for someone to notice that the family disappointment couldn't even manage basic dinner party etiquette. The caller ID showed a number I didn't immediately recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Given the late hour and the formal nature of the evening, I almost sent it straight to voicemail, but a nagging instinct told me to step away from the table and take the call. I excused myself quietly to Mrs. Henderson and Timothy, slipping through a side door that led to Grandview Manor's elegant garden terrace. The October air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of orchestrated humiliation I'd just escaped. The terrace was empty except for a few scattered chairs and small tables where guests might step out for private conversations or a breath of fresh air. String lights twinkled overhead, creating an almost magical ambiance that stood in stark contrast to the nightmare unfolding inside. "Hello," I answered, my voice still shaky from the evening's emotional assault. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Jonathan Mitchell from Mitchell, Crawford and Associates. I apologize for calling so late in the evening, but I wanted to reach you as soon as possible with some rather significant news regarding your divorce settlement." My heart immediately began racing. Jonathan Mitchell was David's lawyer, one of the most respected family law attorneys in Connecticut. During our separation proceedings, he'd been polite but distant,
treating me with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he saw me as an unfortunate obstacle to be navigated rather than a client deserving of genuine advocacy. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he continued, his tone markedly different from our previous interactions. There was something almost deferential in his voice that I'd never heard before. "No, it's fine," I managed, though my hands were beginning to tremble. "What kind of news?" "Well, Mrs. Hartwell, I'm calling to inform you that the arbitration panel has reached their final decision regarding the asset division in your divorce case, and I must say, the outcome is quite extraordinary." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, afraid I might miss something crucial. Through the terrace windows, I could see the anniversary celebration continuing inside, the warm glow of crystal chandeliers illuminating Beatrice as she held court at the main table, completely unaware that my entire world was about to shift on its axis. "The prenuptial agreement you signed contained a clause that my client's family apparently didn't fully understand when it was drafted. Specifically, Section 12B, regarding asset forfeiture in cases of marital infidelity." My breath caught in my throat. I remember signing that prenuptial agreement 3 years ago, a thick document filled with legal terminology that David's family lawyer had assured me was a standard protection for both parties. I'd trusted David's explanation that it was merely a formality required by his family's insurance company, something to satisfy their legal obligations, rather than a reflection of anyone's actual expectations about our marriage. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "I'm sorry. Could you explain what that means exactly?" Jonathan's voice took on the careful, measured tone that lawyers use when delivering life-changing information. "The clause states that in the event of a marriage dissolution caused by the husband's extramarital relationships, a significant portion of his family's business assets would transfer to the spouse for compensation for emotional damages and breach of marital contract." I felt dizzy, gripping the stone balustrade of the terrace to steady myself. "I don't understand. How significant?" "Mrs. Hartwell, congratulations. You've just become one of the wealthiest women in Thornfield County. The settlement is valued at approximately $47 million. The phone nearly slipped from my nerveless fingers. $47 million. The number was so astronomical that it seemed like a joke, like some elaborate prank being played on me at the worst possible moment. I looked through the windows at my family's anniversary celebration, at Beatrice accepting congratulations for her thoughtful party planning, at the elegant guests who had just witnessed my public humiliation and banishment to the social equivalent of a children's table. "I'm sorry, did you say 47 million? "Yes, ma'am. The arbitration panel was quite clear. Your husband's family attempted to argue that the infidelity clause was never intended to apply to such a significant asset transfer, but the language in the contract is unambiguous. The Ashford family's legal team made a very expensive drafting error 3 years ago." I had to sit down in one of the terrace chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "But I don't understand. Why didn't anyone mention this possibility during the separation proceedings? Why is this the first I'm hearing about it?" Jonathan's voice carried what sounded almost like embarrassment. "To be completely honest, Mrs. Hartwell, my firm didn't initially take your case as seriously as we should have. When you chose to represent yourself through the mediation process rather than hiring your own legal team, we assumed we assumed this would be a relatively straightforward division of modest marital assets." The admission hung in the air between us. David's family's legal team had underestimated me so thoroughly that they'd overlooked a clause in their own contract that would make me wealthier than anyone in that dining room, including Beatrice and her pharmaceutical fortune. "The paperwork was finalized this afternoon," Jonathan continued. The asset transfer would be completed within 48 hours. Mrs. Hartwell, you're officially the winner in this divorce settlement. And if I may say so, after reviewing the evidence of your husband's conduct during your marriage, justice has certainly been served. Through the terrace windows, I could see Beatrice standing to make what appeared to be a toast, her champagne glass raised high as she addressed the assembled guests. She looked radiant, confident, completely secure in her position as the family's undisputed success story. In less than 2 minutes, she would finish her speech and return to receiving congratulations for organizing such a magnificent tribute to our parents. She had no idea that while she was celebrating her role as the wealthy, accomplished daughter, I had just become exponentially wealthier than she could ever dream of being. The sister she'd just publicly declared a failure, the family embarrassment she'd banished to sit with the hired help, had just inherited a fortune that would make the Blackthorn pharmaceutical money look like pocket change. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I want you to know that I'll be needing your firm's continued services. I have some rather significant decisions to make about how to handle this new situation." "Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. We would be honored to continue representing you. And may I say, it's been a privilege to deliver such positive news." As I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my clutch, I could hear applause erupting from inside the dining room. Beatrice's toast had apparently been well received by the assembled guests, another triumph in her carefully orchestrated evening of family celebration and social dominance. I stood up from the terrace chair, smoothed down my black dress, and took a deep breath of the crisp October air. In the space of a 5-minute phone call, everything had changed. I was no longer the failed sister hiding behind a decorative screen, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion my family was willing to offer. I was now the wealthiest person in that dining room, and it was time to return to the party. Walking back into that dining room felt like stepping into an entirely different universe, though nothing visible had changed. The same crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. The same string quartet played softly in the background, and Beatrice still commanded attention at the main table, her navy silk gown catching the light as she gestured gracefully while speaking to Judge Whitmore's wife about some upcoming charity auction. But I was no longer the same person who had slunk out to take a phone call 5 minutes earlier. The weight of $47 million had fundamentally altered my molecular structure, transforming me from the family failure into something far more powerful than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. Each step across the marble floor felt different now, not the desperate shuffle of someone seeking scraps of acceptance, but the confident stride of someone who could buy and sell half the people in this room without making a significant dent in their net worth. I made my way back toward my exile table, but something had shifted in my posture, my bearing, the way I held my head. Mrs. Henderson noticed immediately when I sat down, her weathered face creasing with concern as she studied my expression. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost," she whispered, her Irish accent making the words sound almost mystical. "Something like that," I replied, my voice carrying a strange new quality that I didn't quite recognize. It sounded calmer, steadier, like it was coming from someone who had just discovered they possessed resources beyond their wildest imagination. From behind our decorative screen, I could hear Beatrice launching into what sounded like another round of gracious acceptance of compliments about the evening's arrangements. Her voice carried clearly across the dining room as she described the careful thought that had gone into selecting Grandview Manor, the attention to detail in coordinating the menu with our parents' preferences, the delicate process of curating the guest list to ensure the perfect blend of family intimacy and social significance. "I just wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for Mom and Dad," she was saying, her tone striking exactly the right note of devoted daughter combined with accomplished hostess.
They worked so hard their entire lives to build something beautiful in this community, and I felt it was important to honor that legacy with an evening that reflected their values and achievements. The irony was so profound it was almost laughable. While Beatrice was discussing values and achievements, I was sitting 20 feet away, having just inherited more money than our parents had earned in their entire combined careers. While she was accepting praise for her thoughtful party planning, I was processing the reality that I could throw a party like this every week for the rest of my life without even noticing the expense. Timothy, the teenager helping with service, returned to our table with coffee and petit fours, his young face bright with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from being included in an adult event. "The desserts are really fancy," he whispered conspiratorially. "My mom says they're from some French place in Manhattan that charges like $50 per person just for dessert." $50. The number that would have seemed extravagant to me an hour ago now sounded like pocket change. I found myself calculating absently. At $50 per person, I could provide these elaborate desserts for every resident of Thornfield for approximately 3 years before spending even 1% of my new fortune. Margaret Sullivan, who had been growing progressively more outspoken as the evening progressed, leaned across the table with the blunt honesty that alcohol sometimes provides. "You know what's really ridiculous about this whole thing?" she said, gesturing vaguely toward the main dining area. "Your sister acts like she invented family loyalty, but she's the one who just publicly humiliated you at your own parents' anniversary party." Her words carried more clearly than she probably intended, and I noticed several nearby guests turning to glance in our direction. The conversation at adjacent tables had grown quieter, as if people were straining to overhear whatever drama might be unfolding in the designated outcasts corner. "Margaret, maybe we should keep our voices down," I suggested, though with less urgency than I might have felt earlier in the evening. "Why?" she demanded, her voice gaining volume and clarity. "So we don't disturb the perfect family celebration? So we don't remind everyone that Beatrice just threw her own sister under the bus for the entertainment of Thornfield's social elite?" The words seemed to hang in the air, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence that spread outward from our table like stones dropped in still water. I could see guests at the nearby tables exchanging glances, their conversations faltering as they processed what they'd just heard. From the main table, Beatrice's voice faltered mid-sentence as she became aware of the shift in atmosphere. Her perfectly orchestrated evening was developing an unscripted complication, and I could see her scanning the room to identify the source of disruption. When her eyes found our table, her expression shifted from confusion to irritation to something approaching alarm as she realized that Margaret's outburst had drawn attention to the very situation she'd worked so hard to manage discreetly. The elegant guests who had been hanging on her every word about party planning were now looking toward the corner where the family drama was apparently unfolding. I stood up slowly, my movement drawing even more attention from the surrounding tables. The simple act of rising from my chair felt different now, not the desperate scramble of someone trying to escape embarrassment, but the deliberate gesture of someone preparing to take control of a situation. "Actually, Margaret, I think you're absolutely right," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet that had descended over our section of the dining room. Beatrice was on her feet now, moving toward our table with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she intended to manage this disruption before it could escalate further. Her face had taken on the controlled expression she wore when dealing with social complications, pleasant but firm, authoritative but not obviously aggressive. "Clarissa," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying the tone of patient exasperation that a responsible adult might use with a misbehaving child. "If we what?" I interrupted, my voice steady and clear. "If we pretend that banishing me from the family table was somehow appropriate? If we act like your public assessment of my marriage and my worth was just sisterly concern?" The dining room had grown noticeably quieter now, with conversations stopping at tables throughout the space as guests realized that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than the typical family anniversary celebration. Even the string quartet seemed to be playing more softly, as if they sensed the need to provide a subtler backdrop for whatever was about to unfold.
"You're being dramatic," Beatrice said, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was less certain of her control over this situation than she'd been just minutes earlier. "Am I?" I asked, reaching into my clutch and pulling out my phone. "Because I just received some rather interesting news that I think might change your perspective on exactly who in this family is worth celebrating tonight."
The silence in the dining room was deafening. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments poised mid-note as they sensed the electric tension crackling through the air. Every guest in Grandview Manor's East Wing had turned their attention to our corner, champagne flutes forgotten, dessert forks suspended halfway to their mouths, as they waited to see what revelation could possibly justify this dramatic interruption of such an elegant celebration. Beatrice stood frozen between the main table and my exile corner, her perfect composure beginning to crack around the edges. I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. How to regain control of the situation, how to minimize whatever damage I might be about to inflict on her carefully orchestrated evening, how to reframe my defiance as evidence of the emotional instability she'd spent years documenting for our family's consumption. "Clarissa," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd perfected over years of public corrections, "whatever you think you need to share can surely wait until—" "No," I interrupted, the single word cutting through her attempt to reassert authority. "It really can't wait. Because you see, everyone here has just witnessed you explain why I'm not worthy to sit at the family table. You've made it very clear that my failed marriage, my inadequate social status, and my general disappointing existence make me an embarrassment to the Hartwell family name." I took a step closer to the center of the dining room, my movement drawing even more attention from the assembled guests. Judge Whitmore had actually twisted in his chair to get a better view, his wife leaning forward with the kind of fascination that people reserve for witnessing historic moments or spectacular disasters. "So I think it's only fair," I continued, my voice carrying easily across the marble floors and crystal-adorned tables, "that everyone here should know exactly what my failed marriage has just accomplished." Beatrice's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. "Clarissa, please, this isn't the time or place for what? For truth?" I held up my phone, the device catching the chandelier light like a talisman of power. "I just received a call from Jonathan Mitchell at Mitchell, Crawford and Associates. He's David's attorney, for those who don't know. He was calling to inform me that the arbitration panel has reached their final decision regarding our divorce settlement." The room was so quiet I could hear the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Our parents, who had been enjoying their anniversary celebration just moments before, now looked confused and concerned, clearly unsure why their daughter's private legal matters were being discussed at their elegant party. The prenuptial agreement I signed 3 years ago contained a clause that David's family apparently overlooked when their lawyers drafted it, a rather significant clause regarding asset forfeiture in cases of marital infidelity. I saw Dr. Pemberton's eyes widen with understanding. As someone who'd been through his own contentious divorce years earlier, he clearly grasped the implications before anyone else in the room. His wife nudged him urgently, whispering something that made him nod grimly. "As of this afternoon," I announced, letting each word fall into the silence like stones into still water, "I am now the majority owner of Ashford Industries, along with their development properties, investment portfolio, and liquid assets. The settlement is valued at $47 million. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Gasps echoed across the dining room, champagne glasses clinked as they were set down with trembling hands, and I watched Beatrice's carefully constructed world implode in real time. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish suddenly finding itself out of water, desperately trying to process information that completely upended everything she thought she knew about our family dynamics. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction.
Even as she spoke the words, I could see her doing the calculations, remembering David's family's wealth, understanding that $47 million wasn't just a fortune, it was a fortune that dwarfed her own pharmaceutical money by a factor of 10. I assure you, it's very possible. In fact, it's legally binding as of 3 hours ago. So when you say my marriage was always a joke, you're technically correct. The joke was on David and his family, who thought they were protecting their assets with a prenuptial agreement that actually guaranteed I'd inherit most of their wealth if David couldn't keep his vows. Reginald had gone ashen, clearly realizing that his wife had just publicly humiliated someone who was now exponentially wealthier than his entire pharmaceutical empire. The Blackthorne family fortune, which had seemed so impressive just hours earlier, was now suddenly reduced to a rounding error compared to what I'd just inherited. I turned to address the room more broadly, my voice taking on the confident tone of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to witness this moment. Not just my parents' anniversary celebration, but also the moment when Beatrice's assessment of family success and failure was revealed to be rather premature. The gathered guests sat in stunned silence, clearly unsure how to process this dramatic reversal of fortune. These were people accustomed to understanding social hierarchies, to knowing who belonged where in Thornfield's carefully maintained pecking order. In the span of 5 minutes, their entire understanding of the Hartwell family dynamics had been completely overturned. Our mother finally found her voice, rising unsteadily from her chair at the head table. "Clarissa, dear, I don't understand what's happening. This is supposed to be a celebration of our anniversary."
And it is, Mom, I said, my tone gentler now as I addressed our parents directly. I'm celebrating your 35 years of marriage, your commitment to building something meaningful together, and your success in raising 2 daughters who have both achieved significant financial independence. The only difference is that one of us achieved it through strategic marriage planning, while the other achieved it through strategic divorce settlement. I could see Beatrice's mind racing, trying to find some way to salvage the situation, to reframe this disaster in terms that would preserve her social standing. But there was no reframing $47 million. There was no spinning a settlement that had just made me one of the wealthiest women in Connecticut. I think, I continued, addressing the room once more, that this would be an excellent time for me to make a toast of my own. To family, to love, to the importance of reading legal documents carefully, and to the satisfaction of proving that sometimes the family disappointment surprises everyone. I raised an imaginary glass, since I'd never actually been served champagne at my exile table, and smiled at the assembled guests with the kind of serene confidence that only comes from holding all the cards in a game where everyone else thought you were already eliminated. "Oh, and Beatrice," I added, turning to face my sister directly, "I'll be needing that seat at the family table, after all. I think we both know I've more than earned it." 6 months later, I stood on the terrace of my newly purchased estate overlooking Thornfield Harbor, watching the sun set over waters that now technically belonged to me as part of the extensive waterfront property portfolio I'd acquired through the Ashford settlement. The irony wasn't lost on me that this particular mansion had once belonged to the Cavendish family, the same people who had witnessed my humiliation at that anniversary dinner were now my tenants in the various properties I'd purchased throughout Thornfield County. The transformation had been swift and thorough. Within weeks of the settlement finalizing, I'd established Hartwell Holdings, a comprehensive investment and development company that was rapidly becoming one of the most influential business entities in Connecticut. The girl who had once sat behind a decorative screen, grateful for scraps of family acceptance, now employed half the people who had witnessed her public degradation. My phone buzzed with its 3rd call of the day from Beatrice. I glanced at the screen and sent it to voicemail, just as I had with the previous 47 calls she'd made over the past month. The desperate messages had evolved from initial shock, "Clarissa, we need to talk about what happened at the party," to bargaining, "I know I made some mistakes, but we're family," to barely concealed panic. "People are asking questions about our relationship, and I need to know how to respond." The social dynamics of Thornfield had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, everyone who had ignored me for years was discovering urgent reasons to renew our friendship. Mrs. Cavendish, who had looked at me with pity that night at Grandview Manor, had sent 3 handwritten invitations to tea over the past month. Judge Whitmore's wife had appeared at my office unannounced, claiming she'd always admired my artistic sensibilities and wondering if I might be interested in joining the board of the Thornfield Cultural Foundation. Most amusingly, Reginald Blackthorne III had requested a private meeting to discuss potential business synergies between Blackthorne Pharmaceuticals and my new holdings company. The man who had sat silently while his wife publicly humiliated me was now desperately trying to position himself as a valuable ally to someone whose net worth had rendered his family's pharmaceutical fortune relatively modest. The real vindication, however, came from unexpected sources. Jonathan Mitchell had become one of my most trusted advisors, his firm now handling not just my legal affairs, but serving as general counsel for Hartwell Holdings. During our weekly strategy meetings, he'd often reference that night at Grandview Manor as a turning point that had taught him never to underestimate the quiet ones. "You know," he'd said during our most recent consultation, "in 30 years of practicing family law, I've never seen someone handle sudden wealth with such strategic precision. Most people would have blown through millions trying to prove themselves to people who never deserved their attention in the first place. Instead, I'd done something far more satisfying. I'd built an empire." Hartwell Holdings had acquired the Millbrook Gazette, Thornfield's primary newspaper, allowing me to ensure that local coverage of business and social events reflected a more accurate understanding of community leadership. When the paper ran its annual Influential Women of Thornfield feature, the article about my business expansion and philanthropic initiatives took up 3 full pages, while Beatrice's charity work merited a brief mention in the community notes. I also purchased the building that housed Beatrice's favorite spa, the exclusive salon where she'd held court among Thornfield's socialites for years. The new management had implemented policies requiring advance reservations and payment in full. No more house accounts for wives who assumed their husbands' business relationships guaranteed permanent credit lines. But perhaps my most strategic acquisition had been Grandview Manor itself. The previous owners, facing mounting debt and declining bookings, had been eager to sell to someone who had both the capital and the vision to restore the property to its former glory. I'd kept the existing staff, improved their working conditions and compensation, and established a memorial garden on the grounds dedicated to family resilience and the power of perseverance. Tonight, I was hosting my own celebration in the very dining room where Beatrice had orchestrated my humiliation. The occasion was the first annual Hartwell Foundation Gala, benefiting scholarships for first-generation college students and funding small business loans for entrepreneurs from modest backgrounds. The guest list included everyone who had been present that night 6 months ago, along with several dozen additional community leaders who were eager to align themselves with Thornfield's new power structure. The irony was exquisite. The same room, the same crystal chandeliers, the same elegant atmosphere, but this time I was the one determining who sat where, who received recognition, and who would be remembered as the evening's gracious host. Elena Rodriguez, the artist who had created my parents' anniversary portrait, was being honored as the foundation's first artist in residence, her work now displayed prominently throughout the mansion I'd purchased with Ashford money. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had shown me kindness during my exile, was being recognized for 30 years of service to Thornfield families and receiving a full scholarship for her granddaughter's college education. Most satisfying of all, Margaret Sullivan, the family's former alcoholic embarrassment, who had been the only one brave enough to call out Beatrice's cruelty that night, was now the foundation's director of community outreach, a position that came with a substantial salary, comprehensive benefits, and the respect she'd never received from our family, despite her honest assessment of their behavior. As guests began arriving for the evening celebration, I watched from the same terrace where I'd taken Jonathan Mitchell's life-changing phone call. The circular driveway was filling with luxury vehicles, just as it had that night in October. But this time, the passengers emerging from those cars were coming to honor my vision, my success, my generous contribution to the community I'd chosen to invest in rather than abandon. Beatrice's car was notably absent from the arriving procession. She hadn't been invited. The exclusion wasn't vindictive, it was simply practical. This evening was about celebrating people who had built something meaningful through their own efforts, who had contributed positively to their community, who had shown kindness and integrity, even when no one was watching. Beatrice's presence would have been incongruous with the event's fundamental values. Elena approached me on the terrace, radiant in a dress that I'd commissioned from the same designer who had created my outfit for that anniversary dinner. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, gesturing toward the elegant scene unfolding inside. I smiled, thinking about the girl who had sat behind that decorative screen just 6 months earlier, desperately hoping for acceptance from people who had never deserved her respect. I've been ready my entire life. I just didn't know it yet. As we walked back into the dining room where my new table was set with places for people who had earned their seats through character rather than circumstance, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from realizing you were never the problem. You were just playing the wrong game. Now I was playing by my own rules, at my own table, with people who understood that true success isn't measured by how well you can exclude others, but by how generously you can include them. And the view from this table was absolutely perfect.